If she had been dead or unconscious, she would have been prone, sinking to the bottom or floating on top. She definitely was holding herself in a position to avail herself of the last remaining air that had to be trapped in that car. Farrar reaches out and takes hold of the right thigh, and as soon as he touched the body, he knew the woman was dead. The flesh under his grasp was hard as wood. He realizes, quote, "Instead of life-saving, I was evidence gathering." Good morning, you guys. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell, and today I'm pretty excited because we are starting this book. It's Chappaquiddick by Leo Damore. The subtitle of this book is Power, Privilege, and the Ted Kennedy Cover-Up. So we are in for a literal ride. For this series, I don't actually know how many chapters we're going to get through at a time yet. Once we get a few episodes in, I'll probably be able to predict how many chapters and how many pages we can cover in a session. But for this first session, I have read all the way through chapter 5, but I suspect that we're only going to get through 2 or 3. We're also going to cover the introduction. You know what? I feel I should apologize real quick. I think I'm fighting a sinus infection or possibly some allergies, and so my voice may be a little bit off. I know it sounds off to me in my head. I don't know if it sounds off to you, but if it does, I apologize. Hopefully we can get through it without too many sniffles and without too much nasal sound. He opens up, and this is where we are going to start with the chronology. And the reason why is because it actually does help us get into the setting of the story. So, June 5th, 1968, Senator Robert Kennedy is assassinated in Los Angeles. Of course, this is Ted Kennedy's big brother, his only remaining brother at that point. The eldest brother, Joe, had passed away in a plane crash in World War II. The second brother, of course, JFK, was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. So, Senator Robert Kennedy was poised to become the next Democrat nominee for president, and he was assassinated on June 5th, 1968. About 6 weeks later, the first party for the Boiler Room Girls is held in Hyannisport and Nantucket. And it's important to understand what this was. So the Boiler Room Girls were sort of the political machine for Senator Kennedy. And they had been the ones, it was a very early version of Clinton and Obama both famously had what's called a war room. And now a lot of this happens online. But back at this point, they would have perhaps a giant map. Each of the Boiler Room Girls may have known a particular area, but they were tracking districts and counties. These Boiler Room Girls, as they came to be called, were tracking districts and counties all around the nation and keeping up with where Robert Kennedy needed to have big wins in order to, for example, take a state. So it was an early political strategy group, and they were an important part of his campaign. So in July of 1968, the first party for these Boiler Room Girls was held in Hyannisport and Nantucket. They were considered Kennedy surrogates. They were not Kennedy family members, but the Kennedy family held them in high regard because they had been serving faithfully to Senator Kennedy when he was assassinated. This first party was actually organized by Joey Gargan, who is someone we're going to get to know throughout this story, and Joan Kennedy. Now, Joan Kennedy was Ted Kennedy's wife. Joey Gargan was a first cousin to the Kennedy children. His mother was Rose Kennedy's sister. This first party, July 25th through the 27th of 1968. This was not quite 2 months after Senator Kennedy had been assassinated. It was 3 days of a cocktail party, a restaurant dinner out together, sailing, swimming, charades, and a cookout. So they all were spending time together commemorating the campaign and those who had served in it, and just spending time together as those who had had an intense relationship during the campaign. This was their chance to get back together. So the situation that we are in now of July 1969 was the second official get-together. Perhaps they foresaw once a year we're going to go ahead and get together and have these summer soirees where we just remember time together and enjoy and reconnect with those relationships. Well, sometime between the evening of September 18th and the early morning hours of September 19th, 1969, the way he puts it is, Senator Edward Kennedy's car plunges off Dyke Bridge on Chappaquiddick Island. A passenger, Mary Jo Kopechne, is killed. July 19th, at approximately 9:45 a.m., Senator Kennedy gives a statement to Edgartown Police Chief Dominic James Arena, saying he had, at 11:15 the previous evening, taken a wrong turn en route to the ferry landing on Chappaquiddick and gone off Dyke Bridge. He had escaped the accident car and returned to his hotel room. He had contacted police when he, quote, fully realized, end quote, what had happened almost 10 hours later. We will stop our chronology there because that's all we're going to get through today. But suffice it to say, obviously there is legal and court action that takes place in the days and months to follow. The foreword is by a man named Howie Carr. Howie Carr is an American talk show host in Boston. He has 3 columns a week in the Boston Herald, and he's an author of books about the Kennedys and gangsters and politics, and so he's a colorful figure. He starts out by saying, if anyone ever deserved a Profiles in Courage award, it was the late Leo Damore, the author of this book. Of course, the awards are handed out by the Kennedy family, and they are all about not courage, but political correctness. But no one can dispute the fact that Damore put himself and his career on the line to write this book, and that one way or another he paid the ultimate price as a suicide in 1995 at the age of 65. You should know, he references it here in the foreword, but Senatorial Privilege, the Chappaquiddick cover-up, was a New York Times bestseller in 1988. It sold more than 1 million copies. This book came out in 1988, which was 19 years after Chappaquiddick. Now, Senatorial Privilege has been republished as Chappaquiddick. So, if you already have this book, you can read this book. It's just an earlier printing. Leo Damore was actually an unlikely figure to write a book like this. He was born in Ontario and was a reporter for the Cape Cod Times. And his first book in 1967 had actually been a post-assassination look at JFK, the Cape Cod years of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. So a lot of people were publishing these books at this time. You can see why. In 1963, our president had been assassinated, and so in the years that followed, people who had special access to photography or personal stories, or perhaps like this man could do on-the-ground research there in Cape Cod, had the capacity to put together a book, make a living from it, and add to the cultural awareness of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. So that's what he had done. And in the final scene, Leo Damore actually tells a very kind and kind of humanizing story of JFK. There was a major black tie fundraiser being held. And as Damore told the story, after dinner, a high-end house painter named Fred Cayute approached the president and was brusquely challenged by a Secret Service agent. But JFK spots his humble Cape neighbor and yells to the agent, "Let the little guy through." He went over and shook the hand, and the president says, "Freddie, it's awfully nice to see you. I'll see you next year." That's the way all Kennedy books were written back then. Fans of the president, thrilled to know him, fawning in their coverage. That was the way he told the story. Damore got $150,000 advance from Random House to write this book, and he spent years researching the truth. His most important source would be Joe Gargan, who rented the cottage where this gathering was held. He was present throughout the event and an intimate relative on whom Ted Kennedy depended. His last name was not Kennedy. He was not born to a Kennedy. His mother was Rose's sister. You remember me pointing him out. This author, Howie Carr, points out, like Michael Skakel, Gargan was a kinsman, but not really a Kennedy. And like Skakel, in his fury against mistreatment by the family, Gargan would eventually spill the beans. So here in this book, one of the advising... We do get train noises here. I apologize for that. We'll pause and wait. One of the advising voices for this book is Joe Gargan. We have a first-hand account of the night. That's important to note. Gargan explains something that no one ever knew before. Remember, this came out 19 years after the accident, but he shared that after the accident and after repeated rescue attempts, Teddy begins floating an alternative story. Why couldn't Mary Jo have been driving the car? Why couldn't she have let me off and driven to the ferry herself and made a wrong turn? To which Gargan eventually responded, "You told me you were driving." When Damore hands in his manuscript, all hell breaks loose. And you can picture it, because prior to this point, we're talking about 1988, we've read some of the Life magazines, we've seen some of the ways that Ted, even in the later years after Chappaquiddick, was treated with kids' gloves. And so we know how the system viewed the Kennedys. Not only things like the Joe Gargan testimony, but also that as the editors read, they did not realize that the state medical examiner of Maryland blurted out a very inconvenient truth. It was apparent to me from the record that she lived for a certain time underwater. So she breathed. That girl, she breathed. You couldn't just write things like that about the Kennedys back then. Seldom was a word heard that was discouraging or critical of, quote, America's first family. Other people had wanted to talk to Damore but felt they couldn't. So in retrospect, Damore was actually lucky to have found a publisher that was willing to go up against the Kennedy machine and risk their wrath. When it was finally published, critics ignored Senatorial Privilege, but it shot up to the bestseller lists. Howie Carr actually met Leo Damore, and we're about to get into chapter 1, but I want to read you this one final story. I met Damore in 1994 on the 25th anniversary of Chappaquiddick. I was doing my radio show from the cottage on Chappaquiddick, and I booked some of the surviving principals. Only Damore asked me for money, $100. Every time I spoke to him, he seemed nervous and agitated. The day after the show, he telephoned again, begging me to send him the money ASAP, which I did. 15 months later, Damore was depressed and broke, about to be evicted from his rented house in Essex, Connecticut. As a visiting nurse and a constable who was there to serve the eviction notice looked on in horror, Damore pulled out a gun and he took his own life. So Leo Damore had a downfall after this book, and we'll talk about that some. The Boiler Room Girls, as we will read about, have maintained their omerta, a silence, for almost half a century. But on the 5th anniversary of Mary Jo's death in 1974, Rosemary Cricket Keogh did issue the following terse statement. My friend Mary Jo just happened to be in the wrong car at the wrong time with the wrong people. In a strange way, Damore's life turned out like Mary Jo's. He says, for Damore personally, it was the wrong book at the wrong time about the wrong people, and it cost him his life. But at least we still have his book and the truth. So Howie Carr commends us to this book to honor Mary Jo, to dig to the bottom of the truth, and to honor Leo Damore. So that's where we're headed. We'll get into the introduction, and if you're not familiar with my channel, it's not proper to read entire books unless they are in the public domain. So I will not be reading this book outright. What I will be doing is choosing some comments, choosing some details, choosing the various pieces of evidence and sharing them with you, and then raising them for discussion, sort of like a book club format. In that way, we are using this book for our own education and as critics to look at it and see what we believe of it. But we are also honoring him, and I would encourage you to go ahead and purchase this book if you're interested in this topic. It's a nice, thick book with lots of meaty details. There is photography, and so I commend this book to you as we get into it. With that, let's start the introduction. Chappaquiddick has been called the most brilliant cover-up ever achieved in a nation where investigative procedures are well developed and where the principles of equal justice prevail. Interesting to start that way, because there are countries in the world where there are not excellent investigative procedures and there are no principles implied or intended of equal justice. But here in America, we do have those things, and yet this was a cover-up in that very system. People are fascinated by this story. It is a thrilling and engaging story that has all the makings of something that causes us to question what's happening. There's political intrigue, there is the potential for sexual scandal, there is just the kind of celebrity focus of what do the lives of the rich and famous actually do. And then all of us can also insert ourselves through the average people we find in this story who enter because they are an investigator or a ferry driver or some other average Joe person that just happened to find themselves in the middle of this scandal. Charges of ineptitude and lack of diligence abounded, as did insinuations that the machinery of justice crumbled beneath the power and the prestige of the Kennedy family. We have been going through on my channel this book. It's Ask Not, the Kennedys and the women that they destroyed, and we are about 2 weeks from finishing those episodes. But that will end up being 20 episodes of looking at women who were harmed by the Kennedy machine. One of them was Mary Jo Kopechne. You're welcome to go. I will link to that episode and watch the episode on Mary Jo Kopechne. But certainly throughout the course of those episodes and throughout the course of that book, we have seen the ways that the Kennedy machine gets going and women are ground in the gears of it. Women are used up, women are harmed, and justice is prevented by the Kennedy machine. So charges of ineptitude and lack of diligence in this investigation are probably warranted. That's one of the things we're going to be looking at. To his dying day, George Killen, who was the former state police detective lieutenant, what a name. I forget the name that we call that. You guys may remember, but when somebody's name fits their profession. George Killen was the former state police detective and lieutenant. He was the chief of a never-revealed investigation, and he was rankled by Chappaquiddick to the day he died. He said that failing to bring that case to a satisfactory resolution was, quote, the biggest mistake of his long and distinguished police career. 2 months before his death in 1979, he decried the injustice of Chappaquiddick. Senator Kennedy, he said, killed that girl the same as if he put a gun to her head and pulled the trigger. He also notes in this introduction, as he's thanking various people, this book would not have been possible without the wise counsel of Joseph Gargan Jr. and the generosity of former Assistant District Attorney Jimmy Smith. Reluctant to revive memories of a painful episode that resulted in the ruin of his own political career, former District Attorney Edmund Dennis nevertheless disclosed to me his conviction, quote, there's no question in my mind that the grand jury would have brought an indictment against Ted Kennedy for manslaughter if I had given them the case, end quote. Now we get to chapter 1. I do want to note, if you're new to the channel, I live in a house that was built in 1900. So we get traffic noise, we get train noise, but I film in the early hours so that we don't get noise from my loud children. So if you're annoyed by the traffic noise, I apologize for that. Hopefully that and the occasional train whistle will be the only noise that will interrupt our reading. Chapter 1. The ferry at Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard was not scheduled to begin operation until 7:30 a.m. on Saturday, July 19th, 1969. Nevertheless, ferryman Richard Hewitt beckoned a blue Ford waiting at the dock at 7 a.m. On board the On Time. That's the name of the raft-like vessel that crossed the 150-yard channel to the island of Chappaquiddick in under 4 minutes. So let's get a picture of this real quick. There is the Chappaquiddick ferry. It goes 150 yards, which is the same as 1.5 football fields. So it's a very small distance that this ferry is taking cars back and forth all day long. It takes just about 4 minutes to get from one side to the other, and it runs from roughly 7:30 a.m. until midnight. The accident that we will end up talking about happened here. The cottage where they were having the party was here, but this over here is the ferry. The ferry ran between Chappaquiddick Island and Edgartown. And you can see it's just 150 yards. And so the ferryman was going back and forth all day long, bringing passengers to and from Chappaquiddick. And this was the only way onto the island directly from Edgartown, which is in Martha's Vineyard. The Ford went on to Chappaquiddick, left the asphalt for the dirt ruts of Dyke Road. Once they parked, Robert Samuel, who was a high school science teacher, and 15-year-old Joseph Capavella, burdened with fishing gear, get out of their car, and they continue on the sand. After an hour of fruitless fishing, the two returned to their car. Samuel was considering fishing off the bridge. It says he noticed the glint of metal reflecting off of a dark shape in the water 10 feet away on the south side of the bridge. Looking closer through the ripples of tidewater, he discovered the shadowy outline of an automobile turned onto its roof, front end angled toward the bridge. So he is standing on the bridge, 10 feet off of the bridge. He sees a glint of metal. And we need to know about this particular pond. It's called Pucha Pond. We need to know that it is actually a tidal pond. So it was not entirely enclosed. It was connected to the ocean waters. And so the waters would go out and the water would be more shallow. At this point, it is high at 8 a.m. They immediately head for the Dyke house. Now, we'll return to our little map. Right next to this Dyke bridge, about 400 feet away, was the Dyke House, and it was being leased for the summer to a family known as Mr. and Mrs. Pierre Malm from Pennsylvania. Mrs. Malm was preparing breakfast when she heard the knock at her back door. She goes, hears his report that there's a car overturned in the pond, and she immediately calls the Island Communications Center maintained by the Dukes County Sheriff's Office. That was at 8:20 a.m. that call was logged. The fishermen go back to drop more lines off the bridge. They're pretty oblivious and don't seem to have any alarm. Policewoman Carmen Salvador relayed the information to James Arena, who was the police chief, that an automobile was underwater at Dyke Bridge. And she asks, do you want me to send someone over there? He says, no, I'll go. Arena leaves the station with his lights flashing. He's noting that the second day of Edgartown Yacht Club's annual regatta is going to have not great water. It's sultry. The morning is clouding up. It doesn't seem like it's going to be a great day for the regatta. For 13 years, he had served as a Massachusetts state trooper. He had also been in security at Boston's Logan Airport. And so when he saw in the newspaper, noticed that this little town had had a meeting to increase the salary of its police chief to $10,000 in hopes of filling the position, Arena applied for the job before he even knew where this job was. And it turned out it was Edgartown. Edgartown is described as a picturesque former whaling port, tidy, shipshape, and sparkling clean. In May 1967, Trooper Arena became Chief Arena, taking on a job which basically meant that he would be policing the occasional excesses of seasonal pleasure seekers, upon whom Edgartown's tourist economy depended. More or less, he left the grind and found a cush job in a sweet little whaling town where he would just be with vacationers. That's what we're being told. That's what he expected, and his expectations were about to be blown out of the water. Pulling up to the ferry landing, he asked Dick Hewitt, "You hear anything about an accident at Dyke Bridge?" "Not until now," Hewitt said. In 20 years, the bridge at Dyke Road had never been the locale of an automobile accident. Arena makes his way across the ferry and goes over to park beside the bulkhead, which is, I didn't know this, the retaining wall structure with driven wooden piles and timbers down that keeps back the sand and the land. So he parks near the bulkhead and asks the young men who are fishing on the bridge, "Is there a car over there?" And Samuel points him on the other side. So they're over here fishing. He says, "Oh, it's over there." From the slope of the humpbacked bridge, Arena saw an automobile submerged, but for rear tires beginning to show above the waterline. So now it's not quite 9 a.m. Tires are starting to poke up. And this, again, we are going to want to pay careful attention to the tides. My hope is that we will learn more, especially once we get into the evidence portions of this book, about where the tides were when the car would have gone off of the bridge. There were deep gouges in the curbing that traced the path the automobile had taken before plunging into the pond. Arena judged the marking on the bridge's dusty planks. Weren't really what you could call skid marks, he said. They were more like scuff marks that probably were brought about by tires going sideways, sliding more than skidding across something. Arena looks over and saw a woman approaching. It was Mrs. Malm, and she was coming to take a look at the accident for herself. She tells him that she had heard a car going past her house faster than usual around midnight, but nothing else. Irina was amazed that she had not heard the car hit the water. And now, like I just mentioned, we live in an old home and the insulation is not great. There's this weird corner right over here near my window where I'm sitting. And at least once a day, someone tries to cut it too close and the bottom of their vehicle scrapes because there's a big dip. And so I get what she's saying. You get used to the noises and the traffic patterns around your house, and you kind of grow to tune them out, but you do notice unusual noises. About a week ago, a vehicle turned and they had a long trailer, and it made the most horrendous screeching noise as it tried to make the turn, and then they tried to back up, but it made it even worse, and they ended up finally getting onto the road and pulling up and pulling off to check the back of their vehicle because they even heard how bad the noise was. So I get this for sure that, you know, she was used to hearing the occasional car go by, but they would go slow. And she says there was a car around midnight that went way faster than usual, but she had not heard the car hit the water. So the police chief asks if she has a men's bathing suit that he can borrow. He decides he's going to go ahead and get in. She does have some swimming trunks that belonged to her husband. And so he walks to the pond and he wades in, swims out towards the car, and there is a strong turbulence from the current. The entire time that we're talking about this accident, as I've mentioned, but also during this rescue effort, they are battling a fierce current, and it is difficult for them. He dives under. He catches only a blurred glimpse of the automobile before he's dragged away by this strong outgoing tide. He estimates that the tide is running to a depth of 6 feet because he can touch the bottom. And he suddenly has this sense of potential dread. He realizes whoever had driven off the bridge might not have escaped, might have been crushed. The vehicle is upended, and they could even maybe be trapped inside. Any survivor would have reported the accident by now, and he had checked the police log before he left the police station. There had been no reports on the answering machine that recorded calls even after the police station was closed. So they had an early answering machine system that would have collected the details, and there had been nothing like that. He radios the communications center and he asks for the police station to send over an officer and for the fire department's scuba diver to come to the scene right away. Irina looks over to some boys standing near the bridge, and he asks if they know where there's a face mask that he could use, and they point to a little flat-bottom boat off near the side. One of the boys runs over and finds a mask and tosses it to Irina. Irina dives back into the pond, and the current is just knocking him out of control. He's having a hard time staying where he wants to be. He ends up letting the current sweep him away because he realizes he's not going to be able to do anything, and he needs the official diver to come in. So he hoists himself up onto the undercarriage. He finds seating space beside the gas tank to await the arrival of help. Irina had actually cut his toe on some of the metal of the car, but he didn't even care. He is thinking now, thinking, what is happening? He has this sense of dread. And at 8:45, so earlier when I talked about the tides, I said 9, but I'm guessing that was more like 8:30. The tides were around 6 feet at 8:30. If you don't know, I'm kind of a note taker in the sides of my books, and hopefully that will help keep us on track as we move through the book so that I can come back and find details from this first telling. But now we're at 8:45. He looks over and he sees the blinking red light on the fire chief's station wagon. He's followed by a man named Betancourt And with the fire chief was a volunteer fireman named Lawrence Mercier, and also police officer Robert Brugier. Arena calls out to Brugier, see if you can get a registry listing for this license. And he calls out the plate number, which is L78207, from the submerged car's inverted front bumper. This car, as we read about this description, was submerged like this. It was resting on the front right here. This is the front windshield, and the back is sticking up. So you can see that would be where the license plate was sticking up enough to where Arena can read it out. Arena watches John Farrar, who is the chief investigator. He's also the diver. He is the person who is going to go down and investigate the car crash under the water. He's the only person who gets to see it in its intact state. John Farrar is adjusting an oxygen tank across his back. He's the captain of the Search and Rescue Division for Edgartown, and he had received a call at 8:25 to proceed at once to Dyke Bridge on Chappaquiddick. It's now 8:45. He had left, went in pretty quick to a turf and tackle shop that he managed that kept diving gear at the ready. He grabs that and he starts changing en route. So by the time he gets there at 8:45, he is ready to go. All he has to do is slap the tank on his back and he's in. 20 minutes from the call to when he's ready to get in the water. Arena's attention was diverted by Brugier calling out the information that he had received over the cruiser's radio. License plate L78207 had been issued to Edward M. Kennedy, the JFK building in Boston. That's the address. So, Arena's concern about the accident turns to a higher frequency of alarm. He is now on high alert, but he has really no time to ponder the stunning news that it's Ted Kennedy's car that he is sitting on, because Farrar is swimming toward him, holding a safety line. He gives Arena one end of the rope, puts an oxygen tube in his mouth, and dives underwater. Now we get the report of John Farrar, and I'm going to try to go slow through this part, and then I think based on the time we are going to need to make our Chapter 1 observations. So we're going to get through the introduction and Chapter 1 for this first episode. When his mask cleared, Farrar saw in the wash of watery light what he likened to the sfumato effect of a Rembrandt painting. If you don't remember, I looked it up. Sfumato is a hazy, tonal color type painting where shades gradually fade into one another, and so everything's not crisp and specific. So we've got this hazy, shaded kind of effect going on. An Oldsmobile sedan is balanced on the brow of its windshield, tipped forward from the weight of the engine so that its rear end was tilted towards the surface. The car was facing the opposite direction it had been traveling before plunging off the bridge. Only speed could account for such aerial maneuvers, Farrar said later. The car must have been going at a pretty good clip to land almost in the middle of the channel, he said. Farrar peers through the driver's side open window. Okay, we're going to go forward, but I just want to say my first impression, and I have read about Chappaquiddick. I watched the movie. Obviously, I've never read in depth like this. I was shocked to realize that there had been an open window. Captain John Farrar said it was within an inch of full opening. So we have a nearly fully open window. The driver's side open window. For me, this raises so many questions, but we're going to keep on going. It took 20 seconds for his eyes to grow accustomed to the gloom inside the car. The front seat was empty. Farrar made his way to the back of the car, fighting a current he estimated was running 4 knots. It's hard to swim against for any length of time. I just want to say, I feel super pleased with the level of research and detail that we are getting in this book. One of the criticisms that people had about Ask Not was that they didn't always know when things were being reported as truthful and specific, and when a conversation was just in the author's mind, trying to get inside the personality of that person. So it is very helpful to read this and realize this is careful research that's been done and is being put out to the world as exactly that, careful research 19 years later. Through the top right-hand corner of the rear window, so it's upside down, top right-hand corner of the rear window, Farrar sees 2 motionless feet clad in sandals. So long as there was a possibility that the occupant might be alive and breathing, he suddenly needed to hurry. He realizes he has to expand the air in the automobile and he needs to bring a resuscitator if necessary. So he moves quickly to the right side of the car. The rear passenger window had been blown out. Shards of glass formed a ragged edge along the frame. Again, I want to move forward, but y'all, seriously, there are 2 windows that are open in this thing. I just felt really confused when I read this because my perception was one of Mary Jo being stuck in the car, and maybe she tried to wedge the doors, but they were stuck in the sand and the windows were closed and she had no chance of getting out. It's very confusing to learn that there were 2 windows that were, one was blown out, one was completely retracted and nearly all the way open. Moving on. Farrar thrust himself through the portal inside the car to his waist. Looking up, he found the body of a young woman. Her head was cocked back, her face pressed into the footwell. So we're imagining this, the car is upside down, so her face is up in the footwell of the car. Both hands gripped the front edge of the back seat to hold herself in place in conformity with its upholstered contours. He said it was not a position assumed by a person knocked unconscious by the impact of a crash. If she had been dead or unconscious, she would have been prone, sinking to the bottom or floating on top. She definitely was holding herself in a position to avail herself of the last remaining air that had to be trapped in that car. Farrar reaches out and takes hold of the right thigh, and as soon as he touched the body, he knew the woman was dead. The flesh under his grasp was hard as wood. He realizes, quote, "Instead of life-saving, I was evidence gathering." Because I was the only person who would be able to observe this situation, it behooved me to think about what I saw underwater to be able to report it. So he knows that his careful observations in this moment matter a great deal. And we also need to pay attention to his specific things that he notices because he was the first one on the scene. He sees her hands, he sees her head, he sees her position, he sees the windows, he notices where the car is balanced. He's the first guy on the scene. And so we should pay careful attention to his observations. He rotated the body inside the car, and it was complicated, listen to this, by the victim's hunched posture and outstretched arms made inflexible by rigor mortis. So her body, her hands are outstretched and hardened into the position that he found her in. He says the body was about 1/4 positively buoyant, meaning it gave buoyancy. It still had some buoyancy. he says, quote, "There was still a little air left in her." Farrar drew the body through the window head first, and a little gold chain around her waist comes undone and slips off. He struggles to maintain his position beside the car because of the current, and he realizes if he doesn't do something, he could lose the body as he swims up to the surface. So he takes the safety line and binds it around her neck and then tugs on the rope, and he carries the body up. He holds the body over himself and pushes off the ground to go to the surface. This difficult recovery had taken him 10 minutes, y'all. This is 30 minutes from the original call. We have to keep this in mind as we go through the rest of the story. An experienced diver could have made it to the scene and gotten Mary Jo out in about 30 minutes, even if you have to wait a few minutes for the ferry driver to get his pants on and get there. It's about 30 minutes from the initial call to the search and rescue to her being out of the car. That's how easy it was. If there was any air left in that car, then that is not reporting the accident, is indeed manslaughter. I mean, the other thing I'm just thinking about is, can y'all get over this poor man who he thinks he's taking a cush gig out in this sweet little coastal town. He's got a vacation spot with just, excited islanders. That's who he's going to be dealing with. And now this cush job has suddenly had this dark cloud come in. He's got top-reaching ramifications with this one car accident. For the first time in several years that Farrar had known Irina, he had known him to be a very placid individual, calm and collected. But now Farrar observes him to be excited and emotionally wrought up. Irina had a quaver in his voice when he said, "My God, it's a body. Do you recognize her? Is it one of the Kennedy clan?" "I haven't had a chance to see if I recognize her or not," Farrar said. So he turns the body over in the water. See, he had been focused on rescue. He was not thinking, "Oh no, my career's on the line. Oh no, this could be a Kennedy." He's just thinking, I want to save this person, whoever it is. I want to get in there and do the best job I can to either resuscitate them or, if they're already dead, to carefully collect information. He is a well-trained diver and search and rescue man. Irina, who had been well-trained, his training goes out the window for a moment in the face of the power of the Kennedys. Irina examines the face for a Kennedy family likeness, and Farrar observed, quote, "a great look of relief," end quote, on Irina's face before he said, "Oh, thank God, no, I don't recognize her. It isn't one of the clan." I mean, we've got to give him a little bit of space here in this response. He is totally in fight or flight. He's near hyperventilating. He's normally a very calm and collected individual, and he is just stressed out at the thought of his sweet little sea haven spot being turned into a scandalous place involving a Kennedy. And this is a dawning awakening that we're going to see him go through over the next few hours. He may have also been thinking about the Kennedy sorrows that they all had on their minds at this point in history. This is 1969. 1968 had been RFK's assassination. 1963 had been JFK's assassination. And then there had been the loss of Rosemary, that we don't know exactly how open the family was about that loss, but that was a loss. And then Kick Kennedy had died in a plane crash, and Joe Jr. had died in a plane crash. So at this point, he may be, who knows how many things his brain is doing. Well, Farrar helps draw the body out of the water onto Irina's lap, and as he holds the corpse in his arms, Irina is just observing this pale woman, lightly freckled, that she's rigid in death. It says the mouth was open and her teeth were gritted in a death grimace. Pale eyes stared through only partially closed lids. She wore a long-sleeve white blouse and navy blue slacks. She had a friendship bracelet on her left hand. 2 gold bracelets dangled from her wrist. Quote, she appeared normal in that there were no injuries that I could see, Irina said. Quote, if she hadn't been wringing wet, it was as if she was about to go to work or to a party because everything was in place. Everything was buttoned right up. The fireman calls out from the bulkhead, do you want the boat? And they push it out on a rope. And so they place the body across seat slats and the body is drawn back to shore and then passed hand over hand to the bridge. The body was placed on a stretcher in the back of the police cruiser. And a medical examiner is summoned, an undertaker, and a tow truck. As required in all fatal automobile accidents, the Registry of Motor Vehicles had to be notified too. And Irina says, and see if you can see where Ted Kennedy is and get him down here. Farrar dives back down to retrieve that gold chain that had detached from the body, and he looks around the rest of the car to see what he can see. On the interior roof, because the roof's on the ground, he finds a workman's lunch pail lacquered with a decoupage of flowers and fashioned into a handbag. When Irina opened it, water gushes out with cosmetics and various grooming items. A wallet containing a Virginia driver's license is inside and a pass for the United States Senate identifying Rosemary Keogh of Washington, D.C. There were also 2 keys to a room at the Katama Shores Motor Inn of Edgartown. He radios the communication center to verify that Keogh was registered at that motel, and minutes later he receives confirmation that she was one of 6 young women who had occupied 3 rooms since Thursday, but none of the beds had been slept in the previous night. So, none of the women had gone to the hotel. Irina told Farrar to check downstream. He realizes it's possible there were other people in the car that might have been swept out of the windows and drowned. So we need to look for any other potential survivors or victims. Irina initially thinks, let's not mess with the crime scene. The tow truck arrives, but he says, no, the registry inspectors don't like it when the car crash scene is disturbed before they can do their investigation. So we're just going to leave it. But then he starts to evaluate the growing crowd of spectators and he changes his mind. There's nothing really to account for this. He was acting responsibly initially and thinking according to protocol, but because it was a Saturday, the registry office was closed, there's a growing crowd of people, he says, I don't think we can get a hold of them. Better get the car out, hold it at the garage. And he says, that is Ted Kennedy's car down there in the water. Oh, gee, I just saw him at the ferry landing on the Chappie side, the tow truck driver says. So Ted is already at the ferry on the Chappie side. He identifies that Ted is already here. Oh, I better get a hold of him, Irina says, and he starts walking down Dyke Road. Now we meet very quickly Christopher Huck Look. Look was a deputy sheriff and a special duty police officer. Look had gotten a call that his help might be needed on an accident, and so he headed down. Irina tells him, you can probably help keep traffic away from the bridge. There's a car overturned in the pond and we're trying to find out if there's anyone else in it. I saw a car last night, Look said. I hope to God that isn't the same one. Irina is too preoccupied to continue this conversation and he walks off. He is headed in the direction of locating Ted Kennedy. So that is where we end chapter 1. And I just have so many questions, you guys. I ended this chapter. First, I just want to say, Damore is very careful, he's very detailed, and he's orderly. And I really appreciate that because I'm taking careful notes and trying to keep them straight in my brain about what we know and what is clear, so that as Ted Kennedy makes his statement and as the investigation goes on, we can keep this first set of details very crisp and clear in our minds and compare those later statements and later investigations with what was actually seen and observed in the moment. So I've already said it a couple of times, but I do feel like I really hope a researcher is able to clarify the tidal depths for us so that we know how deep the water was when the accident happened, where the high point was, and when the low point was, and all of that. That seems rather important. The other thing is that Farrar strikes me as very methodical, very well trained, and able to do his job. So he seems like a narrator and an observer that we can trust in this situation. And Arena intends to be methodical. He comes across as someone whose intentions are good, but that he is responsive to pressure, that when he starts to realize the political pressure or even internal pressure of, oh no, I need to handle it this way, or oh, those people are there, I better make a quicker decision, that he is more quick to allow pressures, whether internal or external, to affect his decision making, whereas Farrar seems to just deliberately do the thing that he knows he'll have wanted to do later. And then I wasn't expecting some of these details, that there were 2 busted windows. That really surprises me. It raises so many questions for me. The driver's side window was rolled open almost to full capacity, and then the rear passenger's window was blown open, and there are shards of glass lining the frame, but he's able to get in and out rather quickly. So it does raise the question of, if she was there gripping, what was it that prevented her from going out one of these windows? Was she not a swimmer? Was she not in her right mind? If she was breathing air, why wouldn't she have gone through one of those windows? That's a big question for me that suddenly was raised by this firsthand account that the window was open and one was blown out. Seems like, why wouldn't she get out? Maybe I'm not understanding things properly, but it doesn't seem that hard to me. I don't know. What do you think? And then her body position matters. That death grip of her holding the seat and holding her face in place does seem intentional, doesn't it? It does seem like there was thought and purpose in her body posture to hold herself in a position and, as he said, perhaps be intaking the last bit of air. So that's kind of a terrifying thing to consider. And then that he felt she had positive air buoyancy as he's dealing with her body. And he's the only one who gets to interact with that initial found body. Later, when they move her, she's gone through the water with Farrar, but he's the only one who interacted with the body as found. So these are some of the questions I have. What questions and observations do you guys have? I hope we can get through these 2 at a time, because my goodness, we have over 50 chapters. It's an excellent story, but my goal at this point, considering how long this has taken, is that we will at least try to get through 2 chapters every episode. So I hope you'll come back and join me. The story of Chappaquiddick is pretty fascinating. We're not necessarily going to need to go through every chapter as carefully as this one, but I do feel that this initial look at the accident, and then probably the next episode where we go through Ted's initial response to the accident, these are ones that we want to go through rather methodically so that we make sure we get the information clear. So I hope you'll continue to join me. I hope you'll leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you're new to the channel, I hope that I've earned your subscription today. This is how we go through books. We don't read them exactly, but we do try to intake the good bits and then discuss them together. We have a great community in the comments. So I hope you'll join us, like, subscribe, and share with a friend. You guys have a great day. Bye.